Okay, class, today we're going to talk about changing fractions to decimals to percents. That will be the next level of dealing with fractions and decimals here. Okay, so let's see if we can begin. So let's review a little bit from the last couple of lessons that we've had. How do you change a fraction to a decimal? Well, if you remember correctly, to change a fraction to a decimal, something like 1/2, you simply divide top in, bottom out, 1 divided by 2. And then you get an answer of 0.5 because you add a decimal, add a 0, and do your division. Well, how do you change a terminating decimal to a fraction? Well, if you remember, terminating decimals are decimals that stop, such as 0.6, okay, or 0.25. Those decimals are terminating decimals because they stop. They do not keep going. So the way we do that is we just say it correctly using place value. So we can't say this one is 0.6. We have to say it is 6/10. And then, of course, we then simplify our fraction. In this case, 6/10 would simplify down to 3/5 if you divide both of those by 2. 0.25, well, you can't really change it that way, so we say it using correct place value. And the way you would say this one correctly is 25 hundredths. So we would write that as 25 over 100, which we know simplifies down to 1/4. So to change a terminating decimal to a fraction, you just say it correctly using place value. Well, what about a single digit repeating decimal, or the whole thing is repeating? How do I change that back to a fraction? Take, for example, 0.06 with a bar. Okay. Well, we learned from yesterday's lesson that to change a repeating digit or repeating decimal back to a fraction, we can't just say it correctly. We have to do what I call the 9 thing. So that means we take, in this particular case, take the number, put it on top, and we put a 9 on bottom. And then this one would simplify down to 2/3. Well, what if we had more than one digit repeating? Well, as long as the entire decimal is repeating, then you take the decimal number, put it on top, and for each digit that repeats, you put a 9 on bottom. And then 45/99 would simplify to 5/11. And then each of these, you would want to check those on your calculator to make sure that you actually get this particular decimal value. So if the whole decimal is repeating, you put the decimal number on the top, and for each repeating digit, you put a 9 on the bottom. For decimals that only part of it repeat, there is another procedure that we will use, and we will talk about that a little bit later on in the year. So today what I want us to talk about is that third level. Okay, we've now figured out how to go from a fraction to a decimal, or a decimal back to a fraction, but now we need to go to the third cousin, which is the percent. So fractions, decimals, and percents all go hand in hand. So let me pull up this little information here about percentages, okay, so that we can talk about percents. The first thing that we need to understand is, what is a percent? And percent means out of 100. It's what it always means. A percent is a comparison of a number to 100, and it's always 100 no matter what that number is. You can have a percentage greater than 100. You can have a percentage less than 1. But every time we're doing that, we are comparing a number to a percentage. Okay, we can use the percent symbol, this little symbol right here, to represent that as a handy way to write a fraction with a common denominator of a 100. For example, instead of saying 8 out of every 100 professional basketball players are female, we can say 8% of the professional basketball players are female. A percent can always be written as a decimal, and a decimal can always be written as a percent just by moving the decimal point 2 places to the right like this. So in this one we have 0.85. So if we move that decimal 2 places to the right, that gives me 85%. So please remember, percent means a comparison to 100. Now back in elementary school, when you dealt with this, we had these little 100 squares that we always used, and we got to color in. Okay, so if we had 5%, the way we would represent 5% is we would shade in 5 squares. Okay, if we had 10%, we would shade in 10 of the squares, any 10 of them that would be there. 75% would be, 75 of these squares. That would be 75%. So 75% of it shaded. And 100% would be the whole thing. Okay? And what we need to remember is that if we have 100%, we have 100 of them shaded out of 100. That's just equivalent to 1. So 100% is the same thing as one whole thing. So if you said you ate 100% of the pizza, that means that you ate one whole pizza. So what we want to attempt to do today is learn how to go from fractions to decimals to percents and backwards and forwards. You should be able to take any fraction, change it to a percentage, or any decimal and change it to a percentage, or any percent, change it back to a decimal, or any percent and change it to a fraction, whether that decimal is a terminating decimal or a repeating decimal, no matter what. So let's see if we can do a few examples. So to change a decimal to a percent, you do just like the previous slide said. You move the decimal 2 places to the right. Move the decimal to the right 2 places. So let's see if we can do a few questions. So here is 0.25. So what will that be as a percentage? Well, if we take the decimal and move it 2 places to the right, we end up with 25%. Well, what about 0.02? Well, 0.02 is pretty small. It's like 2 cents out of $1. We move the decimal 2 places to the right. That's equivalent to 2%. Okay, 1.6. So this one's got a whole number in it. Okay, so anytime you have a whole number, when I move this decimal over, and yes, you have to move it 2 places every time, even if there aren't enough numbers to move it. And for those places that we don't have, we just add a 0 in. In this particular case, 1.6 turns into 160%. So yes, you can have percentages greater than 100. Okay, now this one, 0.0035. Well, when I move this decimal over 2 places, I end up with 0.35%. And yes, you can have percentages that are less than 1%. This is a very small amount. But yes, you can have those particular numbers. Okay? Well, what if I wanted to go the other way? Percent to decimal. Well, you just move the decimal back the other direction. You move the decimal to the left 2 places and take off the percent sign. Very important to take off the percent sign because it is no longer a percentage. It is then a decimal. So 45% is the same thing as 45 out of 100. Okay, but that 45%, it doesn't have a decimal in it. So where's the decimal at? It's always at the end. Always at the end. If a number does not have a decimal, it's always at the end. And in this case, we're going to move the decimal 2 places to the left and take off the percent sign. So 45% is the same thing as 0.45 or 45 hundredths. 1.5%, move the decimal 2 places to the left. And again, any place that doesn't have a number in it, we add a 0. So 1.5% turns into 0.015. 325%, again, here's a number that doesn't have a decimal in it, so we find it at the end. We move it over 2 places, and any percentage greater than 100% will always have a whole number. So in this case, 325% becomes 3.25. Okay, now this one is 0.025%. That's a very small percentage, but I'm still changing it to a decimal. So we move it over 2 places. Now some of you may even say, but Mr. Nash, it already has a decimal in it. Just like in this one over here, it already has a decimal. If it has a percent sign on it, it is not a decimal. It is just a percent with a decimal in it. You must move that decimal over 2 places to the left for it to be a decimal. So this one becomes 0.00025. Very, very small number. So let's see if we can do all 3 of these now. Okay, your assignment's going to be something like this. I'm going to give you either a fraction, a decimal, or a percent, and you need to give me the other equivalents. Okay, now we've already talked about changing fractions to decimals and decimals to fractions. We understand how to do that. And with our calculator, it helps a little bit as well. So, a fraction to a decimal. Well, what do we do to change this fraction to a decimal? Top in, bottom out. Now, this is also one of those that we are supposed to be memorizing. So 3/5 is the same thing as 0.6. And if you do the division, that's what you end up with. Now, to change this decimal to a percentage, okay, now, all you have to do really is just kind of go somewhere else. If you actually need to physically move this, move the decimal over 2 places, and then come back and write your answer. Okay, 0.6 would be 60%. Simple as that. Okay? Now, anytime they give you a decimal, it's easier to go to the percentage first. So in this particular case, if I were to move this decimal 2 places to the right to turn it to a percent, I end up with 460%. Remember, if you have a whole number, you're going to end up with a percentage greater than 100. Okay, and now this one was 4.6. Well, to change that to a fraction, we just say using place value, 4 and 6/10. So we would write that as 4 and 6/10, which then simplifies down to 4 and 3/5, because we just dealt with 6/10 up here. Now, 72%. Okay, 72%, it does not have a decimal in it, so we find it at the end. So to change that percent back to a decimal, I move the decimal over 2 places to the left, and we end up with 0.72. Now to go to the fraction, we can do one of 2 things. Okay, we can either change the decimal into a fraction by saying it correctly. 0.72, we would say that is 72 hundredths. Or if we remember what a percentage is all about, percent means out of 100. So 72% means 72 out of 100. Now we have to simplify this one. Now I know right off I can divide this by 2. 72 divided by 2 gives me 36. 100 divided by 2 gives me 50. Well, I can still divide this by 2. 36 divided by 2 gives me 18. 50 divided by 2 gives me 25. Now, a smart thing that most people would do, and I know a smart person would do like me, is I would take the 18 over 25, I would divide that on my calculator and see if I get 0.72. Okay, just to double check, just to make sure. Let's see if we can do just a few more, just be on the safe side. Let's try the next level of problems. These are going to be a little bit tougher. Okay, so now fractions, we got 2 over 3. Now, when you divide 2 over 3, you end up with a repeating decimal. Okay, and if you remember from 2 lessons ago, the way we write a repeating decimal is we write the decimal that repeats 1 time, and we put a bar on it. Okay, so 2/3 would actually, if you divide that out, gives me 0.6 with a bar. Now, to change this into a percentage, this is where it gets a little tricky. Okay, so you got to be real careful. All right, so in this one right here, what we're going to do is I need to move this decimal over a couple places to change it to a percentage. So what I want to do is I want to write it out so that I can see what it looks like. I know what's going on out past where that decimal is actually at. So when I move this over 2 places, I actually end up with 66. But there's one rule about percentages. You cannot have a repeating decimal in a percentage. It must be in the form of a fraction if it's going to keep going. So what I do is I take the decimal, I move it over. So this part right here I don't pay any attention to. Now I got to look at this right here, and I have to ask myself, what fraction gives me 66666666666? Well, in this particular case, it comes back to this one right here, because 2/3 will actually give me the 6 that's repeating. So this would be 66 and 2/3%. Simple as that. Okay? So that one is a little tricky, so we got to be real careful on that one. Okay, the next one, we got 0.125. So let's change that into a percent first. So I can take this and move this decimal over 2 places. So we end up with 12.5%. Now, is this decimal okay? This decimal is just fine because this decimal is a terminating decimal. The only kind of decimal you can't have in a percentage is a repeating decimal. Terminating or just fine. Okay, now, for this one, I can either change this decimal into a fraction, or I can change this into a fraction. Now, this one's a little bit tougher because it would have that decimal in it. So I think I'm going to go with this one. Okay, so this one we would say this as 125 thousandths. 125 thousandths. And when we divide this, believe it or not, 125 goes into both of them. We end up with 1/8 as our answer. Okay. And then the last one, 45 and 5/11. Well, the first thing that we need to do is change the 5/11 into a decimal so we can figure out what's going on. We can find out where the decimal is at. And if you change this one into a decimal, you actually end up with 45.45 with a bar percent. Now, the only reason why I wrote it that way is so that we know that this is still a percentage. We know that we can't have a repeating decimal in the percent like we talked about up here on the first one. But so that I know where the decimal is and I can move it, that's why I wrote it this way. So now, what we've got to do is we've got to take this decimal and move it 2 places to the left. So where does that 45 really start repeating? It really starts repeating with the very first one. So this becomes just 0.45 with a bar. All right? And now, to change this into a fraction, we know we do the 9 thing, where we take the number, put it on top, and for each number that repeats, each digit that repeats, we put a 9 on the bottom. So it's 45 over 99, which will simplify down to 5 over 11 when I divide both of these numbers by 9. So let's review real fast. How do we change a fraction to a decimal? Top in, bottom out, and divide. All we do is divide. So how do we change a decimal to a fraction? Well, we have 2 types of decimals we have to work with. We have a terminating decimal, which all we have to do is say it correctly using place value. That is it. If it's a repeating decimal or repeating digits, we put 9s in the denominator. Put the decimal in the top, 9s in the bottom. Okay, and then simplify, of course. Now, how do we go all the way to a percent? Well, if we have a decimal to a percent, we move the decimal 2 places to the right and add a percent sign. Well, if we have a percent to a decimal, all we have to do is move the decimal 2 places to the left and take away the percent sign. That's all we have to do. Okay, so what we need to remember about fraction to decimal to percent is they all go hand in hand. They all go together. And there's a process that we use in order to change them. And if you remember that process, you'll get them right every single time. Until next time.